He heard the shots before anyone else did. 3 of them. Flat, hard cracks echoing off concrete walls in the underground garage of Aurelius Technologies, a building where Logan Mercer cleaned floors for $11 above minimum wage. He knew immediately what they were. His body knew before his brain caught up. The mop handle hit the floor. His legs were already moving. 6 hours earlier, a cop named Derek Vaughn had stood in that same building and called Logan a nobody in front of 30 people. Now that same man was pinned behind a concrete pillar, bleeding, with 2 gunmen closing in. And Logan Mercer, the janitor, the invisible man, the father nobody took seriously, was the only person positioned to do anything about it. If this is your first time here, welcome. This channel tells stories about ordinary people who carry extraordinary things in silence, and the moments that finally bring those things into the light. If a story like this hits you somewhere real, hit that like button, drop a subscribe so you never miss one, and leave a comment telling me your city and country. I want to see how far these stories travel. Now stay with me, because this one earns every minute. The alarm went off at 5:15 every morning, and Logan Mercer was always already awake when it did. He lay flat on his back in the dark, staring at the ceiling of the 2-bedroom apartment on Garfield Street for exactly 30 seconds, a habit left over from years he didn't talk about. And then he swung his legs over the side of the mattress and started moving. He didn't groan, he didn't stretch theatrically or check his phone. He just stood up, because Ellie would be awake by 6, and breakfast didn't make itself. The apartment wasn't much. The walls could have used a fresh coat of paint 2 years ago. The kitchen faucet dripped no matter how many times he'd tightened the fitting underneath, and the carpet in the hallway had a stain near the bathroom door from the time Ellie had knocked over an entire bottle of grape juice running to show him something she'd drawn. He'd never gotten around to replacing the section. Some nights, when he walked past it in the dark, he thought about how much it cost to replace carpet per square foot. Most nights, he didn't think about it at all. He scrambled eggs with a little cheese, the way Ellie liked them, and cut an apple into wedges because she refused to eat it whole. She was 8 years old and had very strong feelings about apple architecture. He made a coffee for himself, black, in a machine that was older than his daughter. He stood at the kitchen counter and drank half of it while the eggs finished. Ellie appeared in the doorway at 6:03, hair flattened on one side from sleeping, wearing a t-shirt with a cartoon cat on it that she'd had for 2 years and refused to give up, despite the fact that it now barely reached her waist. "Did you make the eggs cheesy?" she said. Not hello, not good morning. "I made the eggs cheesy," Logan said. "Good." She climbed onto her chair. "Mrs. Patterson said we're doing the science fair in March. That's 4 months away." "I know, but I want to do mine on volcanoes." She paused, fork halfway to her mouth. "Or possibly ants." High-stakes decision. "Dad." She gave him a look that was remarkably similar to one her mother used to give him. "I'm being serious." "I know you are. Eat your eggs." She ate her eggs. Logan finished his coffee. The morning moved the way it always did. Quiet, unremarkable, theirs. He drove her to school in the truck, a 10-year-old Ford with a small crack in the passenger mirror that he kept meaning to replace. And she talked the whole way about the ant colony idea, which had apparently grown into a full theory involving tunnels and food science. He listened. He asked the right questions. He parallel parked in front of Westbrook Elementary with 3 minutes to spare, which was better than Tuesday. "Bye, Dad." She leaned over and hugged him around the neck with both arms, in the completely unself-conscious way 8-year-olds still do, before the world convinces them it's embarrassing. "Be good," he said. "Or interesting. Try for both." She rolled her eyes and got out of the truck. He watched her walk through the front door. Then he drove to the grocery store, went home, cleaned up the kitchen, paid 2 bills online, and slept for 4 hours before his shift started. Logan had been on the overnight maintenance crew at Aurelius Technologies for 2 years and 4 months. He'd applied because the pay was reasonable, the hours aligned with Ellie's school schedule, and the company didn't ask many questions if your references checked out, which his did, because 2 people he'd once known had agreed to keep it simple on paper. Aurelius occupied a 17-story tower in the financial district, plus 3 underground levels used for server infrastructure and vehicle storage. From the outside, it looked like every other glass and steel corporate headquarters in a mid-sized American city. Inside, it was a different creature, the kind of building where badge access was tiered, certain hallways didn't appear on the public floor plan, and everyone from the receptionist to the facilities manager seemed to carry the quiet tension of people who understood that what the company did mattered, even if most of them couldn't explain exactly why. Aurelius was in the business of encryption, specifically the kind of encryption that governments paid attention to. Logan didn't care about any of that. He cleaned floors, he replaced light fixtures, he emptied bins and restocked soap dispensers in bathrooms on floors he was cleared to access, which was most of them, because nobody worried much about what a janitor overheard. That invisibility had taken some getting used to at first, not because it bothered his ego, but because it felt strange to move through a building full of people and register as furniture. He'd adapted. You adapted to whatever the situation required. That was the rule he'd lived by long enough that it had stopped feeling like a rule and started feeling like breathing. He was good at his job, not because cleaning floors required particular talent, but because Logan Mercer was constitutionally incapable of doing anything halfway. The floors he cleaned were clean, the work orders he filed were accurate and on time. When something broke, he noticed it before anyone reported it. He didn't socialize much with the other maintenance staff, not because he disliked them, but because he'd spent enough years in situations where unnecessary conversation was a liability and the habit had never fully left. Marcus Webb, who worked the same shift and had been at Aurelius for 6 years, had made peace with Logan's quietness. "You do this thing," Marcus told him once, about 3 months in, "where you walk into a room and immediately look at every corner, like you're casing it." "Old habit," Logan said. "From what?" "Construction work," Logan said, which was not a lie exactly, if you considered the kind of structures he'd helped dismantle. Marcus had let it go. The night Logan Mercer's life shifted was a Thursday in October, and it started with a woman he barely knew. He'd seen Natalie Whitmore the way you see anyone when you work maintenance in a building, in passing, from a distance, with the particular peripheral awareness of someone trained to monitor everything without being caught doing it. She was 30, maybe 31, and she ran the company with the focused, slightly brittle competence of someone who had been proving herself for so long it had become the only mode she knew. She worked late most nights. She had a security detail of 3, a personal assistant who seemed perpetually on the edge of a breakdown, and the kind of posture that came from years of standing in rooms where someone was always waiting for her to flinch. Logan had cleaned her office twice. She hadn't looked at him either time. He didn't take it personally. He wouldn't have looked at him either. But that Thursday night, something was different in the building, and Logan felt it the way he used to feel shifts in terrain, not through any one signal, but through the accumulation of small things that didn't add up. The security rotation was off by 6 minutes. He clocked it without meaning to when he pushed his cart past the guard station on B2 at 11:40. The scheduled change was 11:34. The guard who should have been there wasn't. The guard who replaced him came from the wrong direction. The loading bay camera on the east side of the underground garage had a small red indicator light that normally blinked green. He saw it when he crossed through on his way to the service corridor. It wasn't recording. And one of the service elevators, the one on the north end of B3, which technically wasn't supposed to be in active use after 10 because of a maintenance order Logan himself had filed 8 days ago, was showing activity on the panel. Someone had used it in the last 40 minutes. None of these things were emergencies on their own. Cameras glitched, guards ran late, maintenance orders got ignored. Logan noted them, filed them in the part of his brain that still kept ledgers, and kept moving. He was on the second floor, running a floor buffer near the south end conference rooms, when he heard voices in the hallway, raised, clipped, the specific cadence of a conversation that had already turned into an argument by the time other people showed up to it. Through the glass partition, he saw Natalie Whitmore standing in the corridor with her arms crossed, talking to a broad-shouldered man in a security chief's jacket, Derek Vaughn. Logan knew him by sight and by reputation. Former law enforcement, 12 years. Brought in by the board 18 months ago to overhaul the company's protective infrastructure. He carried himself the way certain kinds of cops did, not with authority exactly, but with the assumption of it, as if rank were something that clung to him even when he wasn't in a room full of subordinates. Logan couldn't hear the words, but he could read the body language without any difficulty. Natalie was pushing back on something. Vaughn was dismissing it. His hands moved in a particular way, flat, horizontal, like he was smoothing something down, that Logan recognized as a gesture people made when they wanted to end a conversation they were winning. He kept buffering, didn't slow down, didn't look too long, but he watched the hallway in his peripheral vision long enough to see Vaughn walk away and Natalie stand there for a moment, alone, before she straightened and walked back toward her office. The confrontation that officially introduced Logan and Derek Vaughn to each other happened the following morning, and it was brief and unremarkable and humiliating in the casual, forgettable way that certain humiliations are. The kind nobody around you thinks twice about, but that sit in your chest for the rest of the day. Logan had come back at 7 to finish a work order on the third-floor utility room. He was in the hallway with his tools when Vaughn came through with 2 junior security staff and a woman from HR, conducting what appeared to be some kind of facilities walkthrough. Vaughn stopped when he saw Logan. "Who cleared this guy to be up here during business hours?" Vaughn said, not to Logan, to the woman from HR. "Maintenance has floor access until 8 for outstanding work orders," she said. Vaughn looked at Logan the way certain people look at things they find mildly inconvenient. Not hostile, not cruel, just dismissive, the way you're dismissive of a chair that's in the wrong place. "What's the work order?" Vaughn said, this time to Logan. Logan told him. "Utility room, 3rd floor, pressure valve on the HVAC secondary line." Vaughn looked at him for another moment, long enough for the 2 junior staff to understand they were supposed to be looking at Logan too. "How long?" 40 minutes, Logan said. Vaughn made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "You've been with facilities how long?" 2 years. 2 years. He turned to one of the junior staff. "Get someone to walk him out when he's done. I don't want maintenance floating around during the security briefing." He said it the way you'd say you didn't want the mail piling up on the porch. Not to insult Logan specifically, to establish, for the benefit of the room, what category of person Logan was. Logan finished the work order in 37 minutes. He let the junior staff member walk him to the elevator. He said thank you, because he was not going to give Derek Vaughn the satisfaction of any other reaction, even one the man would never see. In the truck, driving home to sleep before he picked up Ellie, he thought about the security camera on B2, the guard rotation that was off by 6 minutes. The elevator that shouldn't have been running. He thought about them the way he used to think about things in the field, not with alarm, but with the quiet, patient attention of someone building a picture one detail at a time. Something was wrong in that building. He didn't know yet what. But he'd spent enough years in places where being wrong about that kind of feeling got people killed to ignore it now, just because the only thing at stake was a janitor job he wasn't supposed to care about. Booked. He picked Ellie up at 3:15. She'd decided on volcanoes. "Final answer?" he said. "Final answer," she said. "Ants are interesting, but volcanoes are dramatic." "Can't argue with that." "Did anything happen at work?" she asked, with the guileless directness of a kid who didn't yet understand that most adults answered that question by saying no, even when the answer was yes. Logan glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Slow night," he said. She accepted this and moved on to telling him about a boy in her class named Theo who had apparently eaten an eraser on a dare, which she considered both disgusting and impressive. Logan listened. He laughed when it was funny. He asked the right questions. He drove home through the late afternoon traffic and thought about a security camera with a dead indicator light, and a man who had spoken to him like he was furniture, and the slow, methodical way a threat assembled itself from ordinary pieces before anyone thought to pay attention. He thought, whatever this is, it's not finished. He thought, Ellie needs dinner. He made pasta. He helped with homework. He sat on the edge of her bed while she fell asleep and listened to her breathing even out. Then he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold before he drank it, and he built the picture in his head, piece by piece, the way someone who has spent years doing exactly this kind of work does, carefully, without rushing, because the first wrong assumption is always the most expensive one. By the time he went to bed, he was fairly certain about one thing. Whatever was coming wasn't aimed at the building. It was aimed at Natalie Whitmore specifically. And the person with the best position to make it happen was the same man who'd spent that morning making sure everyone in the hallway understood that Logan Mercer was nobody worth paying attention to. The morning after Logan built his picture at the kitchen table, Aurelius Technologies woke up to the news that 3 armed men had entered the underground garage at 12:47 in the morning, disabled 2 security guards, and gotten within 40 feet of the private elevator bank before a motion sensor that should have been bypassed, but wasn't, because someone had filed a maintenance extension on it 2 days earlier without understanding what that extension actually preserved, triggered an alarm that sent them running. Logan heard about it from Marcus at the start of their next shift, standing in the supply room on B1 while Marcus refilled a cart with cleaning solution and talked the way Marcus always talked when something had shaken him. Fast, with his hands moving. Cameras on the east side were down, Marcus said. The whole east corridor on B2 and B3. Just gone. And the alarm that went off wasn't even a security alarm, it was a maintenance fault sensor. If that thing doesn't go off, those guys walk right to the elevator. Anyone hurt? Logan asked. 2 guards. One's got a broken wrist. The other got hit in the head. They kept him overnight. Marcus shook his head. They're saying it was a robbery attempt. Targeted the executive vehicle storage. Logan said nothing. You believe that? Marcus asked, because he'd been around Logan long enough to read the particular quality of his silences. I believe that's what they're saying, Logan said. He pushed his cart out of the supply room and went to work. The thing about working maintenance in a building that's just experienced a security incident is that nobody changes their behavior around you. The executives still talked in hallways. The security staff still debriefed in rooms with doors they didn't fully close. The administrative assistants still complained to each other in break rooms without checking who was refilling the paper towel dispenser 2 feet away. Logan moved through all of it that night like water finding its level. Quiet, present, taking in everything without appearing to take in anything. What he learned, piece by piece over the course of 6 hours, was this. The cameras on B2 and B3 East Corridor had not malfunctioned. They had been manually switched to a loop, a recorded 30-minute segment of empty hallway, played on repeat. Someone with administrative access to the security system had done it. The alarm that saved Natalie's life, indirectly, was a maintenance fault sensor tied to a pressure door that Logan had flagged for a gasket replacement 8 days ago, and the extension he'd filed had kept that sensor active when the security system reset at midnight. Nobody in the building understood exactly why it had triggered, because nobody had connected the maintenance log to the security grid. Logan understood. He'd written the work order himself. He also understood something else. The 3 men in the garage hadn't been there to rob executive vehicles. The access point they'd used, the North Service elevator on B3, ran directly to the executive suite, to Natalie Whitmore's private office. They'd been testing the route. I thought about that for a long time while he buffered the floor of the 4th floor corridor at 2 in the morning, working the machine back and forth in long, slow passes, the kind of mechanical, repetitive motion that left his hands occupied and his mind entirely free. The question wasn't who had let them in. That answer was already forming, and it had Derek Vaughn's shape. The question was why, and more specifically, what they were after. And the answer to that required knowing what Aurelius Technologies actually had that was worth staging a rehearsal kidnapping to get. He knew enough about the company to have a working theory. The encryption technology Aurelius was developing, he'd heard it referenced obliquely in hallway conversations, in fragments of meetings he'd passed, in the careful way the technical staff never said its name directly when they were outside the secure floors. It was the kind of project that generated that particular nervous reverence among people who understood what it meant. The kind of thing that, if someone handed it to the wrong party, would restructure the digital security landscape of several industries at once. Natalie Whitmore was the only person with unrestricted access to the full prototype. Her schedule, her access codes, her movements, she was the key. Not the building. Her. Logan filed 3 maintenance reports the next morning before he left. All legitimate. All based on things he'd actually observed. One of them, almost incidentally, noted that the North Service elevator on B3 appeared to be showing usage activity inconsistent with the maintenance suspension order currently on file, and recommended a full access log audit. He didn't expect anyone to act on it. He was wrong. Natalie Whitmore called a full security review the morning after the garage incident, and it went badly in the specific way that security reviews go badly when the person running the meeting is also the person who should be under investigation. Derek Vaughn stood at the head of the conference table on the 12th floor and delivered a 40-minute assessment that was thorough, confident, and almost entirely misdirected. Camera failure attributed to a firmware update conflict. Guard rotation discrepancy attributed to a scheduling software glitch. The attacker's knowledge of the executive elevator location attributed to publicly available building permits filed during the tower's renovation 2 years prior. Natalie sat at the other end of the table and listened without interrupting, which people who didn't know her read as acceptance, and people who did know her read as the opposite. The North Service elevator, she said when Vaughn finished. There's a maintenance report flagging unusual usage on B3. Your assessment doesn't mention it. Vaughn barely paused. We reviewed it. Consistent with the repair crew that was down there Tuesday, logged under the facility's work order. The facility's work order that's been suspended since the 14th? A half second. Almost nothing. I'll have my team double-check the access log timestamp. Do that, Natalie said. She did not say anything else in the meeting, but after it ended, she asked her assistant to pull the full maintenance log for B2 and B3 going back 30 days and cross-reference every access entry against the personnel schedule. The report came back to her that evening. Most of it was routine. But one entry stood out, a work order note filed by a facilities employee named Logan Mercer, flagging the elevator's active status 9 days before the incident, before anyone in security had apparently noticed anything was wrong. She pulled his personnel file. It was thin. Deliberately thin, she thought. Not incomplete in a sloppy way, but in the careful way of a file where certain things had been answered with the minimum necessary truth. Prior employment listed construction, general contracting, one entry for a federal contractor she didn't recognize. References checked out. Background clean. No red flags. No red flags. And yet this man had noticed something about her building's security infrastructure that her entire security department had missed. She asked her assistant to find out when Logan Mercer's next shift started. Logan was pushing his cart past the 7th floor break room at 11:15 that night when he heard footsteps behind him that moved with too much purpose to belong to anyone making a late coffee run. He slowed slightly, not enough to be obvious, and cataloged the sound without turning. Single set, moderate heel strike, the specific rhythm of someone who was headed somewhere and knew where that was. Mr. Mercer. He turned. Natalie Whitmore was standing in the hallway in a blazer she'd clearly put on over whatever she'd been wearing when she decided to come find him. The collar of a casual shirt visible underneath, the kind of detail that said she'd been working late and hadn't gone home, and then made a decision she'd acted on before overthinking it. She looked tired. Not the soft tired of someone who needed sleep, but the sharper tired of someone who'd been running on alertness for too long. Ms. Whitmore, Logan said. She looked at him for a moment. He let her look. He'd been looked at like that before. In debrief rooms, mostly, by people trying to figure out what category to put him in. You filed a maintenance note on the B3 elevator 9 days before the incident, she said. You noticed the usage anomaly before anyone in my security department flagged it. The suspension order was in my work queue, Logan said. The elevator showed active. It didn't match the order. That's it? You just noticed it didn't match. That's what maintenance is, he said. Things that don't match get noted. She studied him. He waited. Walk with me, she said. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't the kind of statement that expected pushback either. Logan left his cart where it was and walked with her to the small conference room at the end of the hall, the one used for informal meetings, not the formal one on 12. And she closed the door and didn't sit down, and neither did he. The camera failure on B2 and B3, she said. My security chief says firmware update conflict. Is that what he says? You don't believe that. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. She crossed her arms. Not defensively. It was a thinking posture. What do you think happened? Logan was quiet for a moment. He'd spent the last 2 days deciding how much of this to say out loud, and to whom, and in what order. He hadn't reached a clean answer, but he was standing in a room with the person most directly at risk, and she was asking him directly. And he had spent enough years making judgment calls about when to hold information and when to release it to understand that this was the latter. The cameras didn't fail, he said. Somebody switched them to a loop. That requires admin access to the security system. The access log will show it if anyone looks at the right timestamp with the right query. Natalie's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. My security chief reviewed the access log. I know. The room was very quiet. You're saying Derek Vaughn? I'm not saying anything about anyone by name, Logan said carefully. I'm saying the access log has an answer in it, and someone with the authority to review it is also someone with a reason to make sure that answer stays buried. She looked at him for a long moment. And you've worked out all of this from a maintenance work order. I've worked out some of it, he said. The rest is observation. What kind of observation? He hesitated. Then, The guard rotation was off by 6 minutes the night of the incident. I clocked it when I passed the B2 station. The guard who should have been there at 11:34 came from the wrong direction, which means he wasn't coming from his previous post. He was coming from somewhere else. He paused. The 3 men in the garage weren't there for the vehicles. The route they used runs directly to the executive elevator. They were learning the route. Natalie said nothing for a moment. "You knew all of this," she said, "and you filed a maintenance report." "I filed what I could document," Logan said. "A theory about your head of security isn't something I can put in a maintenance report." "But you're telling me now." "You asked." She uncrossed her arms, looked at the table, looked back at him. "Who are you, Mr. Mercer?" "Facilities, 7th floor," he said. "Don't do that." Her voice was flat, not angry, just done with the deflection. "Nobody who cleans floors notices a 6-minute shift rotation discrepancy and works out a surveillance bypass theory in the same week. Who are you?" Logan looked at her. He thought about Ellie asleep at home, with Mrs. Cardona from next door checking in because Logan's shift ran late. He thought about the answer he'd been giving for 2 years and 4 months, and how long answers like that stayed credible. "Someone who used to do a different kind of work," he said. "What kind?" "The kind I don't do anymore." She waited. He didn't add anything to it. She seemed to recognize that this was the most she was getting tonight, and she made the practical decision to accept it. "I want to see the access log myself," she said. "Not through Vaughn's team. I want a direct pull from IT, someone I trust, tonight." "That's a good idea," Logan said. Can you tell me what query to run? What timestamp? What field?" He thought about it. Then he took the small notepad he kept in his shirt pocket. He used it for work orders and wrote down the specific parameters, the time window, the system field, the user permission tier that would have been required to execute the switch. He tore off the page and handed it to her. She looked at it, looked at him. "This is very specific," she said. "Yes," he said. "How do you know this?" "I've been in a lot of buildings," he said. "You learn how they work." She folded the paper and put it in her blazer pocket. She opened the conference room door and then stopped, one hand on the frame, and turned back. "The incident this morning," she said. "Vaughn's briefing. You were on the floor outside. Did you hear any of it?" "I was buffering the floor," Logan said. "The machine's loud." She almost smiled, not warmly. It was too sharp for that, but it was real. "Of course it is," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer." She walked out. Logan stood in the empty conference room for a moment, then went and found his cart and went back to work. The IT pull took Natalie's trusted analyst 40 minutes and came back at 1:17 in the morning. She called the analyst back twice to confirm what she was reading, because the first time she read it, she was certain she'd misunderstood something. She hadn't. The security camera loop had been initiated at 11:09 on the night of the incident. The user credential that executed the command belonged to Derek Vaughn. He'd logged in from a terminal in his own office, which meant he'd been in the building, which meant every piece of his briefing that implied remote hackers or external system compromise was a fabrication he'd constructed while sitting 20 feet from the people he was deceiving. Natalie sat in her office with the printed log in front of her and thought about the fact that she had hired this man, that she had handed him the architecture of her company's protective infrastructure, that for 18 months she had trusted him with the precise information he had apparently been using to plan against her. She was not the kind of person who fell apart under that kind of realization. She'd built a company from a Series A that most investors had passed on. She'd survived a board attempt to replace her at 28. She'd navigated a partnership collapse that had nearly taken the company with it. She knew how to absorb bad information and keep moving, but she sat with it for a few minutes. Just sat with it. Let herself feel how bad it was. Then she picked up her phone and called her attorney, not her corporate attorney, her personal one, and she told her to be in the office at 8 in the morning. After that, she sat back down and thought about Logan Mercer. She pulled his file again and read it more carefully this time, looking for the seams, the places where a carefully constructed narrative showed its construction. The federal contractor entry, Meridian Group, LLC, with a Virginia address. She ran a quick search. Shell company, dissolved. The kind of entity that appeared in the background histories of people who'd done contract work for agencies that didn't advertise their vendors. She'd seen that pattern once before, in the background of a consultant she'd hired who had turned out to have spent 12 years doing something classified for someone she wasn't supposed to know the name of. She thought about the way Logan had listed the specific access parameters without hesitating. The way he'd clocked a 6-minute guard rotation discrepancy as a matter of course. The way he moved through the building, she'd watched the security footage of him after pulling the maintenance log, and she'd noticed it then without quite knowing what she was noticing. The way his eyes tracked, the way he positioned himself near walls and open corridors, the way he always seemed to know where every exit was before he needed one. She found a partial reference in a cross-check of his name against publicly accessible federal records. Nothing classified, just a discharge date and a service branch. Navy. Honorable discharge 8 years prior. Navy. 8 years ago. She thought about the kind of Navy training that produced the specific set of behaviors she'd observed. She thought about what Marcus Webb had told her security team in passing during the post-incident interviews, that Logan was the quietest man he'd ever worked with and always looked at corners. She thought, I have a janitor who is either the most dangerous person in this building or the safest one, and I cannot currently afford to be wrong about which. 2 days later, she received the message. It came to her personal encrypted inbox, the one only 7 people in the world had the address for, and it was 17 words long. We know what you're building. Surrender the prototype or the next test won't be a test. She read it 4 times. Then she walked down to the 6th floor, where Logan Mercer was replacing a ceiling tile in the corridor outside the server access room, and she held out her phone without saying anything. He read it. He handed the phone back. When did this come in? He said. An hour ago? Have you shown Vaughn? No? Good. She watched him. He was looking at the ceiling tile he'd just seated, pressing on the corner to make sure it was level. He pressed it once, twice, seemed satisfied, and stepped back. The garage incident, he said. The men, the route. That was to confirm the access path and test how you'd respond. He glanced at her. Now they know how your security department responds. They know your communication chain. They know your guard rotation. They've identified which systems can be bypassed and how long they have before something triggers. You said this before, she said, that the first attack was a test. I said it was a possibility. Now they've confirmed it for you. So what do I do? He picked up his tool bag. He didn't answer immediately, which she'd already started to understand was not evasiveness. It was him actually thinking, not performing thoughtfulness. You can't go to your security department, he said, not until you know who else in that structure is involved. Vaughn didn't run this alone. Someone managed the guard rotation. Someone coordinated the timing. So I'm compromised internally. Significantly. And externally? Bringing in outside law enforcement risks tipping them off before you've identified the full network. If they know you've escalated, they accelerate. He paused. There's a window where you control what they think you know. Once you report it formally, that window closes. Natalie thought about this. You're describing a situation where my options are essentially to do nothing or to do something that makes it worse. I'm describing a situation where the timing of what you do matters more than what you do, he said. There's a difference. She looked at him for a long moment. What would you do? I'd find out who else in your security structure Vaughn has in his pocket before I made any move at all, he said, and I'd do it in a way that didn't look like I was doing it. How? Carefully, he said. And then, because he could see that wasn't enough. You have access logs, communication records, scheduling data, so does Vaughn. But he doesn't know that you know what you know. Right now he's running an operation against someone he believes is relying on him for her safety. He looked at her steadily. Use that. She was quiet. Outside, the building hummed with its usual daytime activity, phones, air conditioning, the distant percussion of the elevator bank. You're not just a janitor, she said. It was not a question this time. No, he said. For the first time, he didn't dress it up. She nodded slowly. Whatever she'd expected him to say or not say, she absorbed it without visible reaction, and he respected that. The ability to take new information and reorganize around it without making the reorganization the main event. I need to know what I'm dealing with, she said. If I'm going to trust your read on this situation, I need to know who you actually are. I know you do, he said, and I'll tell you what I can, but not here. He glanced at the corridor camera, the one on the east wall, the one that was actually recording. Somewhere that isn't on your security system. She considered that. There's a parking structure 2 blocks north, level 3. I can be there in an hour. I'll be there, he said. She walked away. He watched her go, then turned back to his tool bag and began packing it up, moving with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been taught, a long time ago, that urgency and speed were not the same thing, and that the difference between them was often the difference between a mission that succeeded and one that didn't. He thought about Ellie. He thought about the ant volcano she'd landed on, a hybrid project combining both original concepts, which her teacher had apparently found alarming, and then, upon further review, genuinely impressive. He thought about the fact that he was standing in a building where a man he'd correctly identified as the inside threat was still walking the floors with a badge and a gun and the full trust of people who didn't know what Logan knew. He thought, this is the part where it gets harder. He thought, it was always going to get to this part. He zipped his tool bag, slung it over one shoulder, and walked to the elevator. The parking structure 2 blocks north of Aurelius was the kind of place that existed in every mid-sized American city, functional, ugly, smelling of oil and concrete dust, with fluorescent lights on level 3 that flickered at irregular intervals, as if the building itself had a nervous condition. At 9:40 in the evening, it was mostly empty. A few cars belonging to people working late at the surrounding offices, nobody walking through. Logan was there first. He parked his truck on the east side of level 3 and stood near the stairwell exit, back to the wall, and waited. He'd checked the structure twice on his way up: stairwells, vehicle count, entry and exit points. Old habit. He couldn't turn it off any more than he could turn off breathing. Natalie arrived 8 minutes later. She came up the north stairwell, not the elevator, which told him she'd thought about it and made the same call he would have made. She was alone. She'd left her phone in her car. He could see it from here, the way her hands were empty, the specific way someone walks when they're not unconsciously checking a device they're not carrying. She stopped about 6 feet away and looked at him. "You checked the structure before I got here," she said. "Yes." "You came early." "Yes." She nodded, filed it, moved on. "Tell me who you are." Logan looked at the flickering light above them for a moment. He thought about how many times he'd had a version of this conversation. With his ex-wife, with his daughter's pediatrician, who'd asked too casually about his work history, with Mrs. Cardona next door, who'd once asked why he never seemed startled by anything. He'd gotten good at the partial version, the version that answered the question without answering it. He didn't give Natalie the partial version. "Navy SEAL," he said. 12 years. The last 4 in a unit that handled high-risk extractions and counterterrorism operations, mostly overseas, some domestic adjacent. He paused. "I left 8 years ago following an operation in which 3 members of my team were killed. The debrief determined the mission parameters were sound. I determined the debrief was wrong." Natalie said nothing. "After I separated, I went through a period that wasn't particularly functional," he said, because he'd made a rule with himself a long time ago about not dressing up the bad years in softer language. "I got married, I had Ellie, I got divorced. The marriage didn't survive what I brought back from that last deployment, and I don't blame my ex-wife for that. After the divorce, I needed work that kept a specific schedule and didn't require me to be something I wasn't anymore. Facilities maintenance fit." "For 2 years," she said. 2 years and 4 months. "And nobody at Aurelius knew." "Nobody asked the right questions," he said. "People see a janitor. They're not looking for anything else." She was quiet for a moment. The flickering light steadied briefly, then resumed its irregular pulse. "The operation you mentioned," she said. "The one where you lost your team. What went wrong?" He looked at her. "Why does that matter right now?" "Because I'm about to decide how much to trust you," she said. "And the answer to that question tells me something about how you think." He considered that. It was a fair point, and she'd made it without any theatrical framing, which he respected. "We had bad intelligence," he said. "Someone in our coordination chain had fed us a facility layout that was accurate for the building but wrong for what was inside it. We went in expecting a target location on the 3rd level. The target was on the 1st. By the time we realized the layout was wrong, we'd committed to a position that cost us time we didn't have." He stopped. "2 of my men died in the extraction. 1 died 3 days later in the hospital. The intelligence failure was traced back to a contractor who'd been simultaneously working for the other side. The debrief called it an anomaly." And you called it something else. I called it a systemic failure that nobody wanted to own, he said, so I stopped being part of the system. Natalie absorbed this. She didn't offer sympathy, and he didn't want any, and he appreciated that she seemed to understand that instinctively. Okay, she said. What do you need to know from me? Everything about the encryption prototype, he said. What it actually is, who knows it exists, and who has requested access to it in the last 6 months. So she told him. The project was called internally by a code name he'd heard referenced in fragments, ArcLight. It was an encryption architecture capable of securing communications at a scale and speed that current commercial and governmental systems couldn't match. 2 years in development, 1 year from deployment. If it worked as designed, it would make Aurelius the dominant player in secure communications infrastructure globally, which meant government contracts, defense applications, and the kind of valuation that would put the company in a different category entirely. 3 people had full technical knowledge of the prototype. Natalie, the lead developer who worked under a security protocol that kept him largely off-site, and the CTO, who was currently in Singapore at a conference and had been for the past 10 days. The list of people who had requested project access in the last 6 months included 17 names. 2 of them were external parties, a government liaison and a representative from a private defense contractor called Hargrove Strategic Solutions, which Logan filed away immediately because Hargrove was a name he'd encountered before, in a context he didn't share with Natalie yet. Vaughn handled both of those access requests, Natalie said. I approved them through him. Did you meet with either party directly? The government liaison, yes. The Hargrove representative said, no. Vaughn said the meeting was preliminary, not worth my time. And you trusted that? She looked at him flatly. I trusted my security chief, yes. That's generally considered reasonable. I'm not criticizing you, he said. I'm building the picture. She accepted that. The Hargrove representative, you recognize the name. I recognize the company, he said. Hargrove has a legitimate defense consulting arm. They also have a second operation that isn't listed on their public corporate structure. It runs private intelligence services for clients who need information acquired through methods that can't be officially attributed. Corporate espionage, she said, among other things. She was quiet. The parking structure settled around them. A distant car engine on level 1, the hum of the ventilation system, the fluorescent light doing its nervous blinking overhead. So Vaughn brought Hargrove in, she said, gave them access to the project outline. That's my read, Logan said. They assessed the value of ArcLight, determined that acquisition through normal channels, purchase, partnership, licensing, wasn't viable or fast enough, and they put together a plan to extract the prototype by other means. By taking you, he said. You're the access point. The prototype lives in your head as much as it lives in the system. Anyone who wants ArcLight completely needs both. Natalie let out a long, controlled breath. Not panic. She was past panic, operating in the cold focus space beyond it. And Vaughn has been inside this since the beginning. At minimum since the Hargrove meeting, Logan said. Possibly longer. I'd want to look at his financial records, but that requires resources I don't currently have. I have an attorney, she said, and I have an investigator she uses. Trustworthy? My attorney has known me for 7 years. The investigator is her husband. I'd stake a significant amount on both of them. Logan thought about this. Get them started on Vaughn's finances, quietly, through channels that don't connect back to you corporately. He paused. And don't change anything in your behavior at Aurelius. Don't avoid Vaughn. Don't treat him differently. He needs to believe you're still operating on the assumption that he's your trusted security chief. You want me to keep working normally with someone who's trying to have me kidnapped? For a few days, yes. She looked at him. You're asking a lot. I know, he said. And he meant it, not as a consolation, but as an acknowledgement of the actual weight of what he was asking. Can you do it? She thought about it honestly, which he appreciated more than a quick yes would have been. Yes, she said. I can do it. Good. He pushed off the wall. One more thing. The 17 names on your access request list. I need you to send that to me through a channel that doesn't touch the Aurelius communication system, personal email, personal device. She nodded. I'll send it tonight. He started toward his truck and she spoke again. Mr. Mercer. He stopped. Why are you doing this? You could have filed your maintenance note, kept your head down, let it develop into someone else's problem. He turned back to look at her. She was standing under the bad fluorescent light, and she looked exactly like what she was. A 30-year-old woman who had built something real and was watching someone try to take it from her, and who was refusing to let that happen even though she was scared, and the refusal was genuine and specific and not performative. "Because I saw it coming," he said. "And I've spent enough time living with what happens when you see something coming and choose not to say so." He didn't explain what he meant by that. She didn't ask him to. He got in his truck and drove home. Mrs. Cardona was asleep on the couch with the television on low. Ellie was in her room, also asleep, her science fair notebook open on the blanket beside her. A diagram of a cross-sectioned volcano with handwritten labels he could see from the doorway. He pulled the notebook carefully out from under her arm and set it on the nightstand. She didn't wake up. He sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a while and listened to her breathe, the way he used to sit in that same darkness on the worst nights after he came home from the military, and sleep wouldn't come, and the apartment felt like something he was visiting rather than living in. The darkness was the same. How was not? He went to bed and slept 4 hours and got up before the alarm. The 17 names took 3 days to run down, with help from Natalie's investigator, whose name was Paul Reeves, and who turned out to be a meticulous, unhurried man in his late 50s who had spent 20 years as a federal financial investigator before retiring into private practice. Reeves worked fast and quietly and delivered his findings to Logan through Natalie in a series of encrypted messages that used no company infrastructure at all. The findings were worse than Logan had expected, which was saying something given what he'd expected. Vaughn had received 3 wire transfers from a holding company registered in Delaware that traced, through 2 shell layers, to a subsidiary of Hargrove Strategic Solutions. The first transfer had come 18 months ago, 2 months before Vaughn was hired. The arrangement had been in place before he ever walked through Aurelius's doors. He hadn't been turned. He'd been placed. 2 other names on the access list flagged for contact with Hargrove-adjacent entities. An IT security analyst named Gareth Cole, who had access to the system administration tier that would have allowed him to run the camera loop, and a junior protective services officer named Ray Tipton, who had been the guard scheduled for the B2 rotation the night of the garage incident, the one who'd arrived 6 minutes late from the wrong direction. 3 people inside Aurelius, all reporting to Vaughn, all connected to the same network. Logan laid this out for Natalie in her personal car, parked in a public garage 4 blocks from the office. They'd established a rotation of meeting locations, changing each time, which had started as his suggestion and which she'd implemented without complaint. She looked at the summary Reeves had compiled. She was quiet for longer than usual. "He was hired to do this," she said. "The board brought him in. I approved the hire." "You approved the hire based on the information available to you," Logan said. "The information was constructed to support the hire." "That doesn't make me feel better." "It shouldn't," he said, "but it should affect how you think about what to do next. This isn't an internal problem you missed. This is a professional operation that was designed to look exactly like a legitimate appointment." She set the papers on her lap. "What do we do with this?" "We use it," he said. "All 3 of them are still in position. They don't know you know. That's leverage, if we're careful about how we use it." "You want to run an operation," she said. "I want to give them what they came for," he said. "A version of it." She turned to look at him. "Explain." "They want arc light. They're going to try to take you to get to it. Instead of waiting for them to choose the time and place, you choose the time and place. You give them a path to the prototype, a false one, and you let them commit to it fully. A trap. A controlled situation, which is better than an uncontrolled one." He paused. "If we wait for them to make their move on their timeline, we're reactive. We don't know when, we don't know where, we don't know the full team. If we create the situation, we set the parameters." She thought about it. "What does that look like practically?" "You tell Vaughn that you're planning to move the prototype to an off-site secure location for the next phase of testing. You give him a specific timeline and a specific location, something plausible, something he'd have reason to believe. A facility you've actually used for secure operations in the past, if you have one." "We used an industrial facility in the Eastport district for server stress testing 18 months ago," she said. "I still have the lease. Vaughn would know about it." "That works," Logan said. "You tell him the transfer is happening in 4 days. He passes that to Hargrove. They assemble their team for the intercept. Meanwhile, I work with whoever in your protective services you trust absolutely, not through the official chain directly, to have people in position before the Hargrove team arrives. And Vaughn? Vaughn comes with you to the facility, Logan said, as your security chief. He'll want to be there to manage the handoff for his clients. When the situation resolves, he's caught in the same net as everyone else. Natalie was quiet. She was turning it over, looking for the weak points the way she clearly looked for weak points in business proposals. Methodically, without rushing to an answer she liked before she'd found the ones she didn't. The fatal weakness, she said, is that he'll have his own team inside the facility. Yes, Logan said. And your plan accounts for that? My plan acknowledges that as the primary risk, he said, which is different from accounting for it. I can position people to limit that risk. I can't eliminate it. So it's a plan with a significant vulnerability. All plans have significant vulnerabilities, he said. The question is whether the vulnerability is manageable. She looked at him. Is this one manageable? If your people are in position before his are, yes, he said. If the timing slips for any reason, it becomes harder. She looked out the windshield at the concrete wall of the parking garage. You're asking me to walk into a building where 3 people working against me will be present, with the knowledge that the security around me is partially compromised, on the theory that we can close the net before it goes badly wrong. That's accurate, Logan said. And if it goes badly wrong? He didn't answer immediately. He gave her the honest silence she deserved instead of a reassurance he couldn't back up. I'll be there, he said finally. Not as part of your official security detail. Vaughn can't know I'm involved. Where will you be? Close enough, he said. She looked at him. He held her gaze. She seemed to understand that this was the full answer, and that pushing for a more specific one would not produce something more specific, only something less honest. Okay, she said. 4 days. She told Vaughn the next morning. Logan wasn't there for the conversation, but she relayed it to him afterward, sitting in her car with her hands in her lap. He didn't react, she said. That's the thing. I told him we were moving the prototype documentation to the Eastport facility for isolated testing, gave him the date, gave him the logistics, and he just nodded and said he'd adjust the protective detail accordingly. She paused. He was very calm. He would be, Logan said. He'd been waiting for something like this. A reason for you to be in a less controlled location. He asked me if I wanted additional external contractors for the transfer, she said. I told him the regular detail was sufficient. Good. He pushed back gently, said a transfer of this sensitivity warranted extra coverage. What did you say? I said I'd think about it. She looked at Logan. He's going to bring his own people in regardless, framing them as additional contractors. Yes, Logan said. That's exactly what he'll do. She nodded slowly. I hate this. I know. I built that company, she said. It was the first time her voice had lost any of its professional containment, and it wasn't self-pity. It was something harder and more specific. The anger of someone who'd had something she'd made from nothing turned into a weapon against her. 7 years. I built it from nothing, and he walked in and spent 18 months using it against me. And we're going to make sure he doesn't get away with it, Logan said. She looked at him. You sound sure. I'm not sure, he said, but I'm prepared. The 4 days moved strangely. Logan went to work each night, cleaned floors, filed work orders, nodded to Marcus in the supply room. He watched Vaughn twice from a distance, once in the elevator lobby, once crossing the executive floor, and each time Vaughn moved with the easy authority of a man who believed the situation was under his control. The confidence wasn't arrogance. It was the specific calm of someone who had done the planning and was waiting for the plan to execute. Logan understood that calm. He'd had it himself, in the hours before operations that had gone well, and in the hours before operations that had gone wrong. The feeling was identical either way. It told you nothing about the outcome. It only told you about the quality of the planning. He spent the evenings at home with Ellie, which he prioritized deliberately, not as escape, but as anchor. She'd started building her volcano model from papier-mâché, and the kitchen table had become a construction zone of newspaper, paste, and what she called scientific modifications that appeared to involve significant amounts of glitter. That's not a real volcano component, Logan told her, watching her apply gold glitter to the summit. It represents the mineral content, she said, with complete seriousness. Of what mineral exactly? A special one. A special one, he repeated. Dad? She looked at him over her project. Are you okay? He stopped. 8 years old, and she'd noticed something. He wasn't sure what exactly. He'd kept his face neutral, he thought, but she'd noticed. I'm fine, he said, working through something at work. Did someone do something bad? A few people, yeah. She thought about this. Are you going to fix it? He looked at his daughter, who had paint on her elbow and glitter on her nose, and was watching him with the particular serious attention she gave to things she considered important. That's the plan, he said. She nodded like this was satisfactory and went back to her volcano. The night of the operation arrived wet, a light October rain that made the Eastport district darker than usual, the industrial streets slick and reflecting the amber of widely spaced streetlights. Natalie arrived at the facility at 9 o'clock with her legitimate protective detail. 2 agents she'd briefed personally, officers named Chen and Dobbins, both of whom she'd trusted long enough to know their instincts were clean. Vaughn arrived 12 minutes later with what he called the supplemental contractor team. 4 men Logan didn't recognize but had been tracking for 2 days, having pulled their vehicle registrations from the parking records of the building across the street from Vaughn's apartment. Hargrove people. Competent ones, from the way they moved, but not the highest tier. Logan was already inside. He'd entered the facility at 7:15 through a loading dock access he'd located on the building's public permit records, a secondary door not connected to the main security grid, which had been installed during a renovation 3 years ago and apparently never updated in the access control system. He'd spent 90 minutes learning the interior, 4 main corridors, 2 stairwells, 1 freight elevator, a server room cluster in the east wing where the supposed prototype transfer was meant to take place. He positioned himself in a maintenance corridor on the 2nd level that gave him sightlines to both stairwells and the freight elevator via a series of wire mesh observation panels that ran the length of the structure, originally installed for fire safety monitoring. From there he could see without being seen, and he could move through the maintenance corridor to any point in the building within 90 seconds. He had a radio set to the frequency Chen and Dobbins were using. He had his phone locked down, set to vibrate only. He was not armed, which he'd thought about carefully and decided was the right call. He had no law enforcement standing here, and a janitor with a weapon in a building full of corporate security personnel and what were essentially private operatives was a variable that could destabilize the situation faster than it resolved it. What he had was knowledge of the building, knowledge of the players, and 12 years of training in how to be in exactly the wrong place at exactly the right time. The first 30 minutes went as planned. Natalie moved through the facility with Vaughn and the detail, running through what appeared to be a legitimate secure transfer protocol, documentation review, system verification, the procedural theater of a high-value asset handoff. Vaughn was professional, attentive, fully present in the room. He was also, Logan could see from his position on the 2nd level, continuously checking his watch. At 9:47, Logan's radio went to static, both channels, simultaneously. He switched to the backup frequency. Static. He pulled out his phone. No signal. Someone had activated a signal jammer, which meant the timeline had moved up, and the decision to move it had come from Vaughn, and Chen and Dobbins were now cut off from each other and from any external communication. Logan was already moving. He came down the east stairwell in the dark, moving on the balls of his feet, taking the stairs 3 at a time with his hand barely touching the rail for orientation. He could hear it before he reached the bottom. Voices, raised, the specific acoustics of a confrontation that had just crossed from controlled to urgent. He came through the stairwell door into the east corridor and took in the situation in about 2 seconds flat, the way his brain had been wired to do in environments where 2 seconds was all you got. The server room door was open. Inside, Natalie, standing very still. Vaughn, no longer playing a role, his weapon drawn and his security chief's jacket somehow even more wrong now that the pretense was gone. 2 of the Hargrove contractors flanking the door. And on the floor, Chen, who had taken a hit to the side of the head, conscious but not fully functional, one hand braced against the ground, trying to push himself up. Dobbins was not visible, which meant he'd been separated somewhere in the building. The other 2 Hargrove contractors were unaccounted for. Vaughn had his weapon pointed at the middle distance between himself and Natalie. Not directly at her, but close enough that the message was clear. He was talking, low and controlled, the voice of someone explaining a situation rather than threatening one, which was somehow worse. "Nobody gets hurt if you cooperate," Vaughn was saying. "The transfer takes 40 minutes. You give us what we need, we're gone. You call whoever you want to call." "And you expect me to believe that," Natalie said. Her voice was steady. Impressively steady, Logan thought, given what was happening in that room. "I expect you to be practical," Vaughn said. "You're a practical person. It's one of the things I genuinely respect about you." Logan moved. He didn't announce himself. He didn't make a speech. He came through the server room door from an angle that put him between Vaughn's position and the two contractors at the door, a geometry that required both contractors to physically reorient to respond to him, which bought him time they didn't have. The first contractor turned. Logan took him out of the equation with two movements that were ugly and efficient and left the man on the floor with a shoulder that would need medical attention and a weapon that was no longer in his hand. The second contractor was faster. He got his arm up. Logan took the hit across the forearm. It registered as impact, not pain, the way training rewired your response to those things, and used the momentum of it to close the distance and put the contractor against the server rack with enough force that the rack shuddered and the man lost his footing. Vaughn had turned at the sound. His weapon was now pointed at Logan. The room was very still. Logan stood in the middle of the server room, breathing controlled, one contractor on the floor to his left, one against the rack to his right, still trying to find his feet. His forearm was already starting to ache where the hit had landed. He was aware of Chen behind him, still trying to get up. I was aware of Natalie against the far wall, not moving, not making a sound. He looked at Vaughn. Vaughn looked at him. "The janitor," Vaughn said. There was something almost genuine in his surprise. Not full surprise, more like the specific surprise of someone who had accounted for most variables and missed one. "How long have you known?" "Long enough," Logan said. "You're not law enforcement." "No." "You're not armed." "Doesn't look like it." Vaughn's jaw tightened slightly. He was recalculating, and Logan could see him doing it. The specific quality of attention a trained person gives a situation when the situation is changed, and they're working out the new math. "This doesn't end well for you," Vaughn said. "I've been in worse positions," Logan said. Somewhere in the building, there was a sound. Rapid footsteps, multiple sets, coming from the west corridor. Then Dobbin's voice, loud and clear in the way voices get when the person using them needs to be heard through walls. "Aurelius Security, everyone down." Vaughn heard it. His eyes moved briefly toward the door. One brief moment of divided attention. Logan had been waiting for exactly that. What happened in the next 4 seconds was not elegant. It was not the way it looked in movies, where things were choreographed and clean. Vaughn was a former cop with 12 years of experience, and he recovered faster than most people would have. He got one shot off. It hit the server rack to Logan's left with a sound like a metal pipe being struck. Before Logan was inside his guard, and the weapon's angle was wrong, and then the weapon was on the floor and Vaughn was against the wall with Logan's forearm across his collarbone, and the weight of a man who had done this before pressing him into the concrete. Dobbins came through the door 30 seconds later with two people Logan didn't recognize, but who moved like law enforcement, because Reeves had spent the 4 days quietly coordinating with federal contacts, and Natalie had authorized the external escalation 24 hours before the operation, keeping it off Aurelius's internal systems entirely. They took Vaughn out of Logan's hands without ceremony. Chen was on his feet. Dobbins was talking into a radio that was now working again because someone had killed the jammer. The two Hargrove contractors were being managed by people who knew how to manage them. Logan stepped back from the center of the room. His forearm hurt. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the specific adrenaline come down his body had been doing since he was 22 years old, and he'd never fully figured out how to stop it. Natalie was still against the far wall. She was looking at him. He looked back at her. She had a cut on her cheek. He hadn't seen it happen, sometime in the initial confrontation before he'd arrived. It wasn't serious, a thin line of blood along her cheekbone, already drying. She looked at him the way people look at things they need a moment to fully process. "You said close enough," she said. Her voice was level, but barely. "I said close enough," he said. She pushed off the wall. She crossed the room. She stopped in front of him and looked at him for a long moment, the cut on her cheek and the fluorescent light and the wreckage of the room around them. The displaced server rack, the men on the floor, Dobbins coordinating outside, all of it. And she said the only thing that seemed to fit. "Thank you." He nodded. His hands had mostly stopped shaking. "Your face," he said. "You should have someone look at that." "It's fine," she said. "It'll need cleaning." Logan. Logan. First name. He noticed it. "I've had worse." He believed her. Not because he needed to. She was clearly fine, functionally, relatively, but because he'd spent enough time watching her in the past 2 weeks to understand that she wasn't the kind of person who minimized things for the sake of appearances. She minimized the cut because the cut genuinely wasn't the thing she was thinking about. Outside the facility, the rain had picked up. Through the high windows of the server room, Logan could see it hitting the skylights in streaks, the flat industrial windows of the Eastport building making the rain look almost like static. He thought about Ellie's volcano. He thought about glitter that was not a real mineral but represented a special one. He thought, I need to get home. And then, because he was also the kind of person who finished what he started, he stayed and gave his account to the federal officers for the next hour and a half, standing in the corridor with his arms crossed and his forearm throbbing under his sleeve, answering questions in the same quiet, factual voice he'd used for years to give debriefs in rooms that weren't so different from this one. Stripped down, fluorescent lit, smelling of concrete and something chemical, full of people trying to work out what had just happened and who was responsible. Derek Vaughn was in custody. Gareth Cole and Ray Tipton were picked up from their homes within the hour, Cole still in pajamas, according to Dobbins, who relayed the detail with the dry humor of someone who needed to decompress somehow. The Hargrove contractors were talking already, which was the thing about people hired to execute a plan rather than own it. When the plan collapsed, their loyalty to it collapsed with it. The picture was full now, every piece in place. Logan drove home at 2 a.m. through empty streets, the rain still coming down, the truck's wipers doing their uneven beat across the windshield. He parked on Garfield Street and sat for a moment in the quiet cab with the engine off. He thought about 3 men from a mission 8 years ago whose names he still said in his head, sometimes. Not out of ritual, but because they deserved to be remembered by someone who knew exactly what they'd been worth. He thought, I did what I could see to do. He got out of the truck. He went upstairs. He checked on Ellie, who was asleep on her side with her arm around a stuffed dog that had been with her since she was 3. He went to bed. He slept, for the first time in 4 days, without his brain running the building layout on repeat behind his eyes. The federal investigation moved the way. Federal investigations always moved, with a thoroughness that felt almost geological in its slowness from the outside, and with a speed that caught people off guard when it finally reached them. Logan had been through enough post-operation processes to know that the first 48 hours after a takedown were both the most chaotic and the most productive, when people were still shaken and decisions hadn't fully calcified into legal strategy. He spent most of those 48 hours at home. Not because anyone told him to stay out of it. Natalie had made clear he had standing to be involved in whatever capacity he chose, but because Ellie had a science fair presentation rehearsal on Friday, and she'd asked him to watch her run through it twice the night before, and that was the kind of thing that did not move on the schedule of federal investigations. She stood in the living room with her papier-mâché volcano on the coffee table and her handwritten note cards in her left hand, and she delivered her presentation with the particular combination of total confidence and factual looseness that characterized 8-year-olds who were genuinely excited about something. And the lava, she said, gesturing broadly at the summit with its gold glitter mineral deposit. Magma chamber here, which is like the stomach of the volcano. The stomach, Logan said. It's an analogy. Is it in your note cards? She looked at the note cards. It's between the note cards. Okay, he said. Keep going. She kept going. He watched her and listened and asked 2 genuine questions when she finished, and she answered both of them with more confidence than accuracy, and then she asked him if it was good. It's very good, he said, and meant it. She seemed satisfied. She went to bed without too much resistance, which was unusual enough that he stood in the hallway for a moment after her light went out, wondering if she was coming down with something. Then he heard her talking to herself in the dark, running through the presentation again, quietly, the way she did when she was preparing for something she cared about. And he understood she was fine, just focused, and he went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat with it and thought about Derek Vaughn. Not with anger. He'd processed the anger somewhere in the parking structure 2 blocks from Aurelius on the night he'd first laid out the full picture for Natalie. What he felt now was closer to the flat, functional clarity that came after a situation resolved. The operational debrief mode his brain defaulted to when the immediate crisis had passed and the accounting began. Vaughn had been placed inside Aurelius 18 months before the garage incident. That was the fact that kept returning. Not that he'd been turned. Turned implied a man who started loyal and got bent over time, which carried its own tragic logic. Vaughn had walked through the door of Aurelius Technologies already working for the other side. He'd spent a year and a half building Natalie's trust, learning the architecture of her security infrastructure, identifying the personnel he could compromise, and constructing the exact conditions that would make her vulnerable at the precise moment Hargrove needed her to be. That was patience of a specific and professional kind. Logan had seen it before, in people who did what Vaughn did. It didn't make him worse, exactly. It just made him a different category of problem than the ordinary opportunist, which meant the network behind him was also a different category, and dismantling it required more than putting 3 people in custody in an industrial facility in the Eastport district. That was the part Logan was thinking about when his phone rang at 11:40. It was Natalie. He answered. "Are you awake?" she said. "Yes." "Paul found something." A pause. "It's significant." "Tell me." "Not on the phone." She was quiet for a moment. "Can you meet me at the Garfield Street coffee shop, the one that's open late?" He almost asked how she knew about the coffee shop on Garfield Street, which was 4 blocks from his apartment. And then he remembered that she'd investigated his background thoroughly enough to find a classified military discharge record, and a neighborhood coffee shop was considerably less obscure than that. "Give me 15 minutes, he said. The coffee shop was called Paulson's, and it was the kind of place that existed in a specific ecological niche, too honest for the specialty crowd, too decent for the diner crowd, open until 2 in the morning, primarily because the owner had insomnia and found it easier to make coffee for strangers than to lie in the dark. Logan went there sometimes after his shift, when sleep wouldn't come, and he didn't want to be in the apartment with his thoughts. Natalie was already there when he arrived, in a corner booth, both hands wrapped around a mug. She'd changed since the facility. Different clothes, no blazer, her hair down in a way he hadn't seen before. The cut on her cheek had been cleaned and covered with a small bandage that was already starting to peel at one corner. She looked tired in a way that wasn't just physical, the kind of tired that built up over days of maintaining a composed front and then released all at once when the front was no longer required. He sat down across from her. The woman behind the counter brought him coffee without being asked, because he'd been coming here long enough that she knew what he wanted, and he nodded his thanks. Paul finished his deep trace on the Hargrove structure, Natalie said. She had a folder on the seat beside her. She opened it and set 3 pages on the table between them. Vaughn was one piece. The Hargrove subsidiary that ran this operation, they call it internally the Meridian Division, has active placements in at least 4 other companies. Logan looked at the pages. Same methodology? Identical. Long lead times, executive-level placements, security or legal function. Paul found 2 confirmed placements and 2 probable ones. She tapped the second page. One of the confirmed ones is inside a defense contractor that does classified work for the federal government. Logan read the name. He set the page down. "You recognize it," she said. "Yes," he said. "I've encountered that contractor before, in a professional context." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't push. "Paul says the financial trails go deeper than Hargrove," she continued. "The holding structure above the Meridian Division connects to an investment group with ties to at least 2 foreign intelligence-adjacent entities. He's being careful about how he characterizes it because the documentation is still circumstantial at this level. But his read is that this isn't purely corporate espionage," Logan said. "His read is that corporate espionage is the front end of something with a longer strategic purpose," she said. "Acquiring Arclight wasn't just about selling it, it was about controlling who had access to it." Logan turned his coffee mug slowly on the table, a habit he'd had for years, something to do with his hands that wasn't fidgeting. "If that documentation reaches the right federal desk," he said, "this stops being an Aurelius problem." It already has, she said. I made 3 calls this morning. The relevant agencies are now in contact with Paul directly. She paused. I want to make sure that when this expands, the case against Vaughn and the people directly responsible for what happened to my company doesn't get swallowed by a larger investigation and lose its teeth. That's a legitimate concern, Logan said. My attorney is managing it, but I wanted you to know the full picture. She wrapped both hands around her mug again. You built most of this picture. You deserve to know where it goes. He nodded. They sat for a moment in the comfortable quiet of a coffee shop at midnight, the low sound of the counter radio, the occasional car outside on Garfield Street, the owner moving behind the bar in that unhurried way of a man who had nowhere else to be. How's your arm? Natalie asked. He'd forgotten she'd seen him take the hit. Fine, he said, bruised. You should have it checked. I've had worse. She looked at him with something dry and almost amused. That's what I said about my face, and you told me it needed cleaning. Your face did need cleaning, he said. My arm is fine. Logan. She said it the same way she'd said it in the server room, direct, no ornament around it. You took a hit to protect me. You can let someone look at your arm. He looked at her across the table. She looked back. The bandage on her cheek was peeling at the corner, and she didn't seem to notice or care, and he thought that was actually an accurate summary of her. The kind of person who dealt with the serious things and let the incidental ones peel at the edges without much attention. I'll have it looked at, he said. Thank you. She drank her coffee. Can I ask you something personal? You can ask? When you realized I was in trouble that night, in the facility, when you lost radio contact, what did you think? He considered the question. I thought the timeline had moved and I needed to move with it. That's operational, she said. I mean, what did you actually think? He was quiet for a moment. I thought about a mission 8 years ago, he said. A building I'd seen on a layout that turned out to be wrong. The time I lost because of it. He paused. I thought, not this time. She didn't say anything for a moment. That drives you, she said. That mission. It informs me, he said. There's a difference. Is there? If it drove me, I'd be making decisions based on what I needed to fix, he said. Instead, I make decisions based on what's actually in front of me and try to factor out the personal part. Try, she said. Try, he agreed. She nodded slowly. She seemed to be deciding something, or had already decided it and was working up to saying it. He waited. I want to offer you a position, she said, at Aurelius. Formal. Director of Corporate Security and Protective Intelligence. She said it clearly, without preamble, the way she made decisions, directly, without circling. The hours would be structured around your schedule with Ellie. You'd have authority to rebuild the security infrastructure from the ground up. I'd want your recommendations on personnel, systems, everything. Logan looked at her. That's a significant role. It's appropriate for your background. My background is classified. To the extent it needs to be non-classified for hiring purposes, Paul can assist, she said. And frankly, you've demonstrated more operational competence in the last 2 weeks than my entire security department demonstrated in 18 months. I'm not in the habit of letting that walk out the door. He turned his coffee mug again. I'm a janitor, he said. Not defensively, more the way you'd note a fact that needed to be acknowledged before moving past it. You were a janitor, she said. Because it fit your life at the time and because you needed something your life didn't break. I understand that, but things have changed. Some things, he said. The thing that matters most hasn't, she said. Ellie still needs her father. The position I'm describing is designed around that, not as a favor. Because it makes operational sense for the person in that role to have a stake in stability. He looked at his coffee. He thought about Ellie standing in the living room with her note cards and her volcano with its gold glitter, mineral deposit, delivering a presentation with complete confidence and approximate facts, and the kind of earnestness that you spent the rest of your life after childhood trying to find a corner of yourself that still had it. He thought about what it would mean to stop being the man nobody looked at twice, not just to Natalie or to Aurelius, but to himself. To stop choosing invisibility as a permanent condition rather than a tactical one. He thought about 3 men whose names he still said in his head sometimes. I'll think about it, he said. That's all I'm asking, she said. He thought about it for 4 days. In the meantime, the investigation moved forward with the geological speed he'd expected, and then, at certain moments, with a sudden acceleration that caught even the attorneys off guard. The federal warrant for Hargrove Strategic Solutions Internal Communications came through on a Tuesday, and by Thursday, the Meridian Division's full operational history was in the hands of 3 separate agencies. Logan wasn't privy to most of the details. He wasn't law enforcement, had no formal standing in the investigation. But Natalie relayed what she could, and Paul Reeves sent him a brief summary through encrypted channel on Friday that covered the main points. Vaughn had been in contact with Hargrove's Meridian Division for 22 months. His placement at Aurelius had been preceded by a 14-month preparation period during which Hargrove had researched Aurelius's hiring plans, identified the security chief vacancy before it was publicly posted, and built Vaughn's false credentials with enough depth to survive standard vetting. The financial trail ran through 4 shell entities before reaching a legitimate holding company registered in Delaware, and from there, as Paul had suspected, into an investment structure with foreign connections that the federal agencies were now untangling with a thoroughness that suggested they'd been waiting for an entry point into that particular network. Gareth Cole, the IT security analyst, had been recruited by Vaughn 9 months into his placement, a combination of financial inducement and what the preliminary federal summary called leveraged personal information, which Logan read as blackmail and moved on. Cole was cooperating fully. He'd provided the full technical documentation of how the camera loop had been executed and what other system vulnerabilities he'd been instructed to preserve for Hargrove's operational use. Ray Tipton, the junior protective services officer who'd managed the guard rotation misdirection, turned out to be Vaughn's most reluctant recruit, pressured through family debt that Hargrove had quietly purchased from a third-party lender. He was also cooperating fully, and his attorney was arguing for consideration on the basis of coercion, which Logan thought had some merit even if it didn't change what had been done. The Hargrove contractors from the facility, all 4 of them, had retained attorneys and initially said nothing, which was the correct professional choice and would not ultimately help them, because Cole's technical documentation and Vaughn's own communications were sufficient to build the operational picture without their testimony. Logan learned most of this sitting at his kitchen table on Friday morning, drinking coffee that was slightly too strong because he'd been distracted when he made it. Ellie was at school. The apartment was quiet. He thought about the offer. The honest problem with accepting it wasn't fear. He'd made a fairly thorough peace with fear over the years. Not the absence of it, but the management of it. The specific discipline of acknowledging what your nervous system was telling you without letting it run the decision-making process. He wasn't afraid of the work. He wasn't afraid of the exposure. The honest problem was this. For 2 years and 4 months, he had built a life that worked. It was small and it was unglamorous, and there were things about it. The dripping faucet, the carpet stain, the truck with the cracked mirror, that he'd never quite gotten around to fixing, because the life had a particular fragile equilibrium, and he'd been afraid, maybe more afraid than he'd admitted to himself, that changing any significant piece of it would disturb something he couldn't easily rebuild. Ellie had a father who was present, who was at school, pickup and science fair rehearsals, and breakfast every morning with cheesy eggs, who was not deployed, not classified, not inaccessible behind layers of security clearance and mission cycles. That was the thing he'd given her after the marriage ended and the bad years passed. The one thing he was completely sure of. He sat with that for a while. And then he thought about something Natalie had said, not in the coffee shop, not in the parking garage, but in the initial hallway conversation that had started all of it, when he told her he'd spent enough time living with what happens when you see something coming and choose not to say so. He thought about what it meant to choose invisibility, not as a tactic, but as a permanent condition. To use Ellie as the reason, when the truth was more complicated than that. When the truth included a man who had come home from a mission that cost him 3 people and spent years deciding the answer to that loss, was to make himself as small and contained as possible, as if smallness were a form of safety. It wasn't safety, it was management, and there was a difference. He called Natalie at 10 in the morning. "I have conditions," he said. A beat. Then, "Tell me." Ellie's schedule is fixed. School pickup is non-negotiable. Science fairs, parent-teacher conferences, sick days. Those don't move for anything short of a genuine emergency. "Agreed," she said, without hesitation. "I rebuild the security structure my way. with final authority on personnel. No committee sign-off, no board involvement in operational decisions. The board will want oversight. They can have financial oversight, he said, not operational. If they want someone who answers to a committee on tactical decisions, I'm not the right person. A pause. He heard her thinking. I can make that argument to the board, she said. Given current circumstances, I think they'll listen. One more thing, he said. What? I'm not wearing a uniform. A moment of silence. Then she laughed. A real laugh, short and genuine, the kind that catches people off guard when it comes out of someone they've mostly seen in high-pressure situations. Done, she said. Is that all? That's all? Then we have an agreement, she said. He hung up. He finished his coffee. He went to pick up Ellie at 3:15 at. She came out of the school in a rush, the way she always did, as if the building had been storing energy all day and finally released her. She spotted him and changed direction without breaking stride. Dad, I need to tell you something. Hello to you too. Hello, I need to tell you something. She fell in beside him, backpack bouncing. Theo ate another eraser. Same Theo as last time? Same Theo, different eraser. She considered this. I think he might have a condition. Or he really likes erasers. That's not a condition. Depends on the frequency, he said. She laughed. They walked to the truck. He opened the passenger side for her and she climbed in, still talking about Theo's possible eraser situation. And he went around to the driver's side and got in and sat for a moment before starting the engine. Can I tell you something? He said. She stopped talking about Theo and looked at him. What? I'm going to be changing jobs, he said. Same building, different work. I'll be working regular hours mostly during the day. She processed this. During my school time? During your school time, I'll still be at pickup. Okay? She thought about it. Is it a good change or a bad change? He looked at his daughter, 8 years old, with a backpack too big for her frame, and her mother's way of cutting directly to what mattered without any detour through the conversational preamble that most people needed. Good, he said. I think it's a good change. Okay, she said again, satisfied with this, and went back to Theo. He started the truck and pulled out of the school lot and drove home through the ordinary afternoon traffic. Stop signs and yellow lights, and a construction zone on Mercer Avenue that added 4 minutes to the route, and thought that this was the thing people didn't tell you about the decisions that actually mattered. That they didn't feel like pivots. That the world didn't shift around them in any perceptible way. That you made them, and then you drove home through traffic, and your daughter talked about a kid who ate erasers, and the afternoon was exactly as unremarkable as it was supposed to be, and that was precisely the point. The official transition took 10 days, during which Aurelius's board received Natalie's argument for Logan's appointment and the operational authority structure she proposed. And given that their security chief was in federal custody and the alternative was asking a committee to manage a compromised security infrastructure, agreed with a speed that suggested even corporate boards could recognize the situation clearly when they had no good alternative. Logan's first act in the new role was to sit with Chen and Dobbins separately and ask them each the same question. Who in the current security structure did they trust, and why? He listened to both answers carefully. He didn't take notes. He thanked them and spent an evening building a picture in his head, not unlike the picture he'd built at his kitchen table a month ago, but larger, and this time with the authority to act on it directly. His second act was to conduct a full physical audit of every access point in the Aurelius building and all 3 underground levels, not delegated to a team, done personally, room by room and floor by floor, with a clipboard and a flashlight, and the particular methodical patience of someone who had learned to trust his own eyes over documented specifications. He found 11 discrepancies between the official building layout and the physical reality of the structure. Access panels, ventilation corridors, a maintenance shaft on B3 that didn't appear on any schematic he'd been given. He fixed 9 of them. The other 2 he documented and left in place, because knowing about a structural vulnerability was different from eliminating it, and there were conditions under which knowing was more valuable. His third act was more complicated, and it took longer, and it had nothing directly to do with the building. Paul Reeves had flagged the defense contractor with the Meridian Division placement, the one Logan had recognized from a professional context he hadn't explained to Natalie. The contractor's name was Ardent Systems. He had known it from a different angle than Paul knew it now. in the specific context of the procurement chain that had supplied intelligence to his unit before the final operation 8 years ago. The operation in which 3 members of his team had been killed. The contractor whose analyst had provided the building layout that turned out to be wrong. He sat with that for 3 days before he said anything to anyone. The connection might be coincidental. Hargrove's Meridian division had likely placed people in dozens of contractors over multiple years. Ardent might simply be one acquisition on a long list. Or it might not be. The methodology was identical. The timeline overlapped in ways that, when Logan laid it out on paper at his kitchen table one night, did not read as coincidence. He brought it to Paul Reeves directly, not through Natalie, not yet, and laid out the timeline without interpretation. Paul looked at it for a long moment. You're saying the intelligence failure in your last deployment may have been an active operation by the same network, Paul said. I'm saying the timeline doesn't rule it out, Logan said, and the methodology is consistent. That's a federal matter, Paul said, bigger than what we're already in. I know. You want me to pass it up the chain. I want you to make sure it reaches someone who will actually look at it, Logan said, not file it. Paul looked at him steadily. That's a more specific ask than it sounds. I know that too. Paul was quiet. He was a careful man by training and temperament, and he didn't make commitments on impulse. Logan waited, because patience was the one thing he had an unlimited supply of when the matter was important enough. I know the right person, Paul said finally. It'll take time. I know, Logan said. I've been waiting 8 years. I can wait longer. He drove home in the late afternoon, the October light going flat and orange over the city, the kind of afternoon that looked almost warm from inside a car and was actually cold enough to need a jacket the moment you stepped out. He picked Ellie up at 3:15, 4 minutes late because of a light rail crossing on 5th that held him for longer than it should have. She was waiting on the sidewalk outside the school, backpack on, talking to a girl with red braids whom Logan didn't recognize. She saw him and waved. He pulled up. She said goodbye to the red-braided girl and got in. Who's that? He asked. Sophia. She moved here from Portland. Ellie buckled her seatbelt. She's never seen a volcano up close. There are no volcanoes in Ohio, Logan said. I told her she could see mine. She paused. At the science fair. I'm inviting her. That's a good idea, he said. She said she might come. Ellie looked out the window at the passing street. Is it okay if she comes to the science fair? Of course. Even if she doesn't know anyone? Especially then, he said. Ellie nodded, satisfied. She went quiet for a moment. Not the distracted quiet of a kid thinking about something else, but a purposeful one. Dad, she said. Yeah. Are you happier now, with the new job? He thought about that. He thought about the maintenance audit he'd done on his hands and knees in a B3 corridor 2 days ago, mapping a shaft that shouldn't have existed. He thought about Chen and Dobbins and the picture he was building, piece by piece, of a security structure he was rebuilding from the frame up. He thought about Paul Reeves and a timeline on a kitchen table and 8 years of waiting for something to finally reach the right set of eyes. Getting there, he said. She seemed to find this acceptable, not a perfect answer, but an honest one, which she'd always had a better radar for than most adults gave her credit for. He drove home. He made dinner. He helped with homework. He sat at the kitchen table after she was asleep and drank his coffee and thought about everything that was still unfinished, because nothing was ever entirely finished. That was the thing they didn't put in the reports, the part that the debrief never covered. The work had a shape, and the shape extended beyond the moment of resolution, always, into the days and weeks and years after, where the real settling happened, quietly, in ordinary rooms, between ordinary hours. He thought about Natalie, who had gone back to the office the morning after the facility and run a company with a bandage on her cheek and had not, as far as Logan could tell, spent much time needing anyone to notice that she was managing something hard. He thought, I understand that. He thought, I also understand that it's not the only way. He finished his coffee. He went to bed. The building on Garfield Street settled around him in its familiar way. The dripping faucet, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional sound of traffic on the street below. The carpet stain near the bathroom door was still there. He'd been meaning to replace that section for months. He thought that maybe he'd finally get around to it, The sentencing hearing for Derek Vaughn took place on a Thursday morning in February, 4 months after the night at the Eastport facility, in a federal courthouse downtown that smelled of old wood and radiator heat, and the specific institutional staleness of a building that processed difficult things every day without ceremony. Logan didn't go. He'd considered it. Paul Reeves had mentioned it, carefully, in the way Paul mentioned things he thought mattered, without saying directly that he thought they mattered. Natalie hadn't brought it up at all, which he'd come to understand was her version of the same consideration. She'd learned over the months since the facility that Logan made his own decisions about what he needed and didn't need, and that suggesting things he hadn't asked for was a less effective approach than leaving the door open. He didn't go because he had Ellie's parent-teacher conference at 8:30, which was not a negotiable item, and because he'd thought about it honestly, and decided that watching Derek Vaughn receive a sentence would not add anything to his understanding of what had happened or his ability to move forward from it. He already knew what Vaughn had done. He'd worked out the full picture before anyone in that courtroom had. Watching the legal system affix a number of years to it felt less like closure than like a formality, important, necessary, and not something he personally needed to witness. The parent-teacher conference was with Mrs. Patterson, who taught third grade and had the particular quality of a person who genuinely liked children without finding them uniformly easy. She told him Ellie was doing well in most areas, that her reading comprehension was strong, that her math was solid, if occasionally impatient. She tended to skip steps she felt were obvious, which was not always rewarded in third grade math, and that the science fair project had been, and here Mrs. Patterson paused to find the right word, memorable. The volcano, Logan said. The volcano ant hybrid, Mrs. Patterson said, with the gold glitter mineral deposit. She looked at him with the expression of someone who had been a teacher long enough to appreciate the range of things parents produced in children. She explained the mineral as representing a theoretical compound she'd named after herself. The Ellieite, Logan said. You know about the Ellieite. She told me about it 2 weeks ago, he said. I told her it wasn't a real mineral. She told me neither was half the periodic table before someone discovered it. Mrs. Patterson looked at him for a moment. She's going to be a handful in high school. I'm aware, he said. He drove to Aurelius after the conference because Thursdays were his standard office days. He'd established a rhythm over the 4 months that gave him 3 days in the building and 2 working from locations that weren't tied to the Aurelius system, which was a security principle as much as a scheduling preference. He'd explained this to the board once, in a meeting that had been called to review his operational structure, and the board member who'd pushed back most had been the one who eventually came around fastest once Logan walked him through the specific vulnerabilities that a predictable executive security presence created. The board had been a more manageable challenge than he'd expected, mostly because Natalie had been right. Given the circumstances of Vaughn's tenure, anyone arguing for reduced operational autonomy in the new security structure was arguing from a position that was difficult to defend with a straight face. He parked on the 3rd level of the Aurelius garage, the legitimate garage entrance, not the underground executive bank, because he'd restructured the vehicle access protocol as one of his first operational changes, and took the main elevator to the 9th floor where his office was. Not the executive suite. He'd specifically chosen the 9th floor, which put him centrally in the building's vertical axis and gave him proximate access to both the server levels below and the executive floor above without being planted in either one. It was a tactical decision that also happened to mean he ran into a wider range of building personnel on a daily basis than a security director traditionally would, which he considered a feature rather than an oversight. Marcus Webb passed him in the hallway near the elevator bank, pushing a cart. "Morning," Marcus said. "Morning," Logan said. Marcus had taken Logan's departure from the maintenance crew with a combination of resignation and something that might have been pride, which he expressed in the specific Marcus way of not expressing things directly. He'd said, on Logan's last day with facilities, "I knew there was something wrong with you from the beginning," which Logan had correctly interpreted as a compliment. They'd had coffee twice since then at Paulson's on Garfield Street, and Marcus had asked questions Logan answered as honestly as he could, without compromising anything operational. And Marcus had listened and nodded and said, on the second occasion, "You should have told me." "Told you what?" Logan had said. "Any of it," Marcus said. "I would have kept my mouth shut." "I know you would have," Logan said. "That wasn't the issue." What was the issue? Logan had thought about that. I wasn't ready to be someone who had a history yet, he said. I was still figuring out if the history was something I could carry without it being all I was. Marcus had considered this for a long moment over his coffee. And now? Getting there, Logan said, which was the same answer he'd given Ellie, and which he meant both times. The Ardent Systems connection took longer than Paul had estimated, which Logan had expected. Federal investigations with foreign intelligence implications moved through a different kind of bureaucratic gravity. Slower, more deliberate, more subject to the specific friction of agencies that didn't naturally share information, deciding how much to share and with whom. Paul's contact, whose name Logan was given on a need-to-know basis, and who turned out to be a deputy director in a federal agency. He didn't need to specify, had received the timeline Logan had constructed and spent 6 weeks determining that it warranted a dedicated inquiry. The inquiry ran parallel to the Hargrove investigation without officially intersecting it, which was a jurisdictional distinction that made Logan's attorney, he'd acquired one, a practical decision once his role at Aurelius formalized, mildly frustrated on his behalf. The finding, when it came, arrived not as a dramatic revelation, but as a carefully worded document that Paul walked him through at Logan's kitchen table on a Wednesday evening in January, Ellie asleep in her room, the dripping faucet doing its irregular percussion in the background. The intelligence failure in Logan's final deployment had not been an anomaly. It had been an active operation. The analyst at Ardent Systems who had provided the compromised building layout had been a Meridian Division asset, placed 18 months before the operation. The false layout had been constructed to redirect Logan's unit from the correct access point, not to abort the mission, but to delay it, to create a window in which another party could extract the same target through a different route before the SEAL unit reached position. 3 men had died in the delay. The analyst had been identified. He was no longer at Ardent Systems. He was no longer in the country. The federal investigation was pursuing extradition through appropriate channels, which Paul noted with careful understatement could take years. Logan sat with the document for a long time after Paul left. He'd spent 8 years carrying the weight of a mission that the official record called an anomalous intelligence failure, which was true in the narrow technical sense the way a lot of official records were true in narrow technical senses. He'd known, in the way you know things your gut works out before your brain catches up, that it was more than an anomaly. He hadn't been able to prove it. He'd walked away instead because the alternative was staying inside a system he'd lost faith in and doing work he no longer trusted the foundation of. He'd thought, in the bad years and occasionally since, that leaving was the thing he most needed to forgive himself for. That walking away from a career he'd been built for, from the men and women he'd served beside, was a failure of a different kind than the mission failure, more chosen, more avoidable, more his. He sat at the kitchen table with the document and thought about that. What he understood, reading the finding clearly for the first time, the deliberate construction of the false layout, the calculated nature of the delay, the fact that 3 men had died inside a window that someone had engineered specifically, was that he'd made the right call. Not about everything, not about the bad years that followed, not about all of it, but about the core thing. The system had been compromised at a level that made continued trust in it not an act of loyalty, but an act of willful blindness. And he'd been right not to extend that trust, even when being right about it cost him everything he'd built his adult life around. That wasn't comfort, exactly. 3 men were still dead. Nothing changed that or made it smaller. But there was a difference between carrying guilt for a failure and carrying grief for a loss. And he'd been confusing the two for long enough that having them separate out, clearly, documentably, in a federal finding on his kitchen table, meant something he didn't have immediate words for. He sat there until the coffee went cold. Then he got up, rinsed the mug, checked that Ellie's door was closed against the hall light, and went to bed. He told Natalie about it the following morning, in the small conference room on the 9th floor that he used for private conversations. He'd had it swept for devices on his first week, a habit she'd initially found excessive and had since stopped finding excessive. He told her the outline of it. Not every detail. Some of it wasn't his to share freely, and some of it was simply still too recent to lay out in full for another person. But enough. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things he'd come to respect about her. Not the executive listening that performed attentiveness, but actual listening, the kind where you could see her processing in real time, filing and weighing, and not jumping to the response before the information was complete. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. 8 years, she said. 8 years, he said. And you've been walking around with that this whole time. I've been walking around with the version of it I had, he said, which was incomplete. She looked at him steadily. Does it help? Knowing? He thought about how to answer that honestly. It changes the shape of it, he said. The weight is about the same. She nodded. She seemed to understand the distinction without needing it explained further. What happens now? She said. The investigation continues, he said. I'm not operationally involved. I provided the timeline, Paul passed it up, and now it's in the hands of people with the appropriate jurisdiction. That must be frustrating. It's appropriate, he said. I've done my part of it. She looked at him with an expression he'd seen a few times over the past months. Not pity, she was not a person who trafficked in pity, but something more like recognition. Like she was seeing a specific corner of him that matched something she understood from her own experience of carrying things that didn't fit neatly into the structure of a working day. Logan, she said. Yeah. You're allowed to feel like this matters, she said. You don't have to keep it at operational distance. He looked at her across the conference table. She was in her standard working mode, composed, direct, slightly too still in that way she had when she was being careful about something. The bandage on her cheek had been gone for 2 months. The cut had healed clean. I know, he said. Do you? He considered that. I'm working on it, he said. Something in her face shifted. Not a smile exactly, but the thing that preceded one, the small, involuntary movement that happened when a person heard something more honest than they expected. That's the most self-aware thing you've said to me in 4 months, she said. I'm usually self-aware on a delay, he said. I've noticed. They sat in the conference room for a moment in the particular quiet of 2 people who had been through something together and were now on the other side of it, which was not the same as being done with it, but was its own kind of ground. I want to show Ellie the building sometime, Natalie said. It was a different tone, careful, the way she was careful about the things that mattered to her personally rather than professionally. If that's something she'd want, she's heard about the place enough that she probably has opinions. She has opinions about everything, Logan said. She's working on a theory about the optimal desk chair height for elementary school students. Is it peer-reviewed? It involves glitter. Natalie laughed. The same real laugh as in the coffee shop, short and unguarded. Bring her by on a weekend sometime. I'll be here. I'm always here on weekends, which is probably something I should work on. Probably, he said. I will note that you also work weekends. I work weekends because I'm rebuilding a security infrastructure from the ground up after an 18-month active penetration by a corporate espionage network, he said. What's your reason? She paused. I work weekends because working is easier than not working. He looked at her. She looked back, and there was something in the way she said it, flat, exact, without defensiveness, that he recognized as the specific courage of a person admitting something they didn't usually admit out loud. Yeah, he said. I know that one. But, he thought. Ellie came to Aurelius on a Saturday in early March, which was the Saturday after the science fair, at which the volcano ant hybrid with the Ellieite deposit had won first place in its category, a result Ellie accepted with the confidence of someone who had expected it and was now prepared to move forward. She wore her good sneakers, which was her version of dressing appropriately for an occasion. She spent 45 minutes in the building. Logan walked her through the floors he had access to, which was most of them, and she had opinions about everything in the way he'd promised, including the carpet on the 6th floor, which she found an unacceptable shade of gray, and the view from the 12th floor conference room, which she described as actually pretty good. Natalie met them on the 9th floor. She crouched down to Ellie's level when she introduced herself, which was not the thing most adults did, and which Ellie registered and approved of visibly. Your dad says you won the science fair, Natalie said. First place, Ellie said. The volcano had a theoretical mineral in it. The Ellieite. Ellie looked at Logan. You told her about the Ellieite? We work together, he said. We talk. Ellie processed this. Then she looked back at Natalie with the direct, evaluating look she gave to things she was deciding about. Do you actually work here on weekends? Sometimes, Natalie said. My dad works on weekends too, Ellie said. He says it's because of the security infrastructure. He's not wrong, Natalie said, though sometimes I think we both use work as an excuse for things. Ellie considered this with unexpected seriousness. My teacher says that's called avoidance, she said. But she also says it's okay as long as you notice you're doing it. Natalie looked at Ellie for a moment with an expression Logan couldn't entirely read from where he was standing, something between surprised and genuinely charmed. Your teacher sounds smart, she said. She is, Ellie said. She let me name a mineral. Oh, the thing about the life Logan Mercer had built. The original one, the janitor and single-father life on Garfield Street with the dripping faucet and the carpet stain, was that it had been built from a very specific fear disguised as a very specific principle. The principle was, Ellie comes first, which was true and continued to be true and was not in itself the problem. The fear underneath it was, I am the kind of person who destroys things I care about, and the safest response to that is to carry as few things as possible. He'd understood this about himself in pieces, not all at once, the way most people understood important things about themselves, in fragments that only assembled into a coherent picture over time, often when someone else said something that accidentally held a mirror up to the part you'd been avoiding. Natalie had done that, though not deliberately. She'd done it by being the kind of person she was, say, someone who had also built walls, who also used work as infrastructure against vulnerability, who was also managing a version of the same thing Logan was managing, just from a different set of circumstances. Watching her navigate it, watching her notice it, which was what she'd been doing in the months since the facility, with the same methodical honesty she brought to everything else, had made something visible in himself that he'd been stepping around. He wasn't the kind of person who destroyed things he cared about. He was the kind of person who'd been through something genuinely destructive and had made the reasonable decision to limit his exposure afterward, and had then confused that reasonable temporary decision with a permanent condition. He'd been living like the last 8 years were still happening, when they had actually, gradually, in the morning light of 1,000 ordinary days, become the past. He didn't arrive at this through a single conversation or a single moment. It assembled itself slowly over the winter and into the spring, the way things assembled themselves in him, piece by piece, without announcement, until one morning he woke up and the picture was simply there and complete, and he could see it clearly. He replaced the carpet near the bathroom door in April, not because it was urgent, it had waited this long, but because he'd been walking past it for 2.5 years, and it was time to stop walking past it. He pulled up the damaged section himself on a Saturday morning, measured the area, drove to the hardware store on Clement Street, bought replacement carpet in the same approximate color, and installed it with the unhurried competence of a man who had spent 2 years in facilities maintenance and knew how to do this properly. Ellie watched from the hallway doorway with her arms crossed and her head tilted. It doesn't match exactly, she said. It's close, he said. The new part is a little lighter. It'll settle, he said. Give it a month. She looked at the old carpet and the new patch. Why did you finally do it? He sat back on his heels and looked at the work. The seam wasn't invisible. It was a repair, and repairs had seams, and that was fine. Because it was time, he said. She seemed to accept this as a complete answer, which it was. He had dinner with Natalie for the first time that wasn't in a parking garage or a late-night coffee shop in April, a restaurant on the east side of the city that she'd mentioned once in passing as a place she'd been meaning to try, which he'd registered and filed without making anything of it at the time. He called ahead. He made the reservation under Mercer, which was the first time in a long time he'd put his name on something like that without any particular calculation about whether it was a good idea. It was not a smooth or effortless evening. They were both, by nature and by history, people who held things carefully, and sitting across from each other without the structural frame of a professional situation to organize the conversation required more honest navigation than either of them was entirely comfortable with. There were pauses. There were moments where the conversation went somewhere real, and then one or both of them pulled back slightly, not from lack of interest, but from the specific caution of people who had reasons to be careful. But there were also other moments, where she talked about her parents, her father, specifically, a civil engineer who'd worked 70-hour weeks her entire childhood, and who she'd spent years being angry at, and had eventually come to understand differently, not with forgiveness exactly, but with the more complicated thing that came after anger, which was seeing someone whole. where he told her about the year after his divorce more honestly than he'd told anyone. Not the managed version he'd learned to present, but the actual year, with its failures and its smallest humiliations, and the specific morning he'd decided to apply for a maintenance job in a building where nobody would know his name, and how that decision had felt at the time like defeat and now felt like something else, though he still wasn't sure what word went there. She listened to the whole thing without looking away or making it smaller. "What would you call it now?" she asked. "That decision." "Necessary," he said. "I think it was just necessary. I needed to stop being recognizable, even to myself for a while, so I could figure out which parts were worth keeping, and which parts were." He thought about Ellie's first day of school, when she'd held his hand until the moment the doors opened, and then let go so completely it had almost knocked the breath out of him. He thought about Marcus Webb in the supply room, moving fast and talking with his hands about something that had scared him. He thought about three men whose names he still said sometimes. He thought about a parking structure in October, a woman standing under a flickering light asking him to tell her who he was. "More than I thought," he said. She nodded slowly. She was looking at him the way she looked at things she was deciding about. Directly, without performance, without the professional composure that she used when she needed distance from something. "I'm not easy," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I work too much, and I have a hard time asking for things, and I tend to assume that if I don't manage something myself, it won't get managed right, which is probably a character flaw." "Probably," he said. "I'm not saying it to warn you off," she said. "I'm saying it because I think you deserve accurate information." He looked at her across the table. "I cleaned floors for 2.5 years instead of telling anyone I'd been a Navy SEAL," he said. "I'm not exactly without my own complications." The corner of her mouth moved. Not a full smile, something quieter, more internal, the kind of expression that meant something was landing somewhere real. "Fair point," she said. They stayed until the restaurant started putting chairs up around them, which was how you knew a dinner had gone well, not because it was flawless, but because neither of you noticed the time moving. He reached across the table and briefly squeezed her shoulder, which was not a thing he did constantly, because she was 9 and 9-year-olds had dignity to maintain, but which he did sometimes when it seemed like the right call. She didn't shrug it off. The federal extradition process for the ardent systems analyst moved slowly through the appropriate channels in the way Paul had warned, not resolved by summer, likely not by fall. Logan had made his peace with that pace, or was making it, which was the more accurate thing. Some things didn't resolve on the schedule you'd prefer. The work of the Meridian Division investigation continued. Assets were identified, cases built, the slow dismantling of a network that had operated quietly for years inside legitimate corporate and defense structures, doing damage that wouldn't be fully measured for a long time. He did his part of it when asked and stayed in his lane otherwise, because he'd learned slowly, and not without resistance, that the instinct to control every piece of a situation was not always operational wisdom. Sometimes it was the leftover reflex of a man who'd been in situations where losing control meant losing people, and who hadn't fully updated that reflex to account for a life where most of the situations weren't that. Vaughn received 12 years in federal prison. Cole received 4, with credit for cooperation. Tipton received 18 months, suspended to probation, with credit for both cooperation and demonstrated coercion. The Hargrove Meridian Division was formally dissolved as a corporate entity. The parent structure of Hargrove Strategic Solutions was under separate federal investigation for a range of activities that went considerably beyond the Aurelius operation. None of these outcomes felt like justice exactly, because Logan had long since stopped expecting justice to feel like anything in particular. They felt like results. The right results. Mostly, weighted imperfectly by the realities of legal process, which was how results usually came. Aurelius rebuilt. Logan rebuilt the security structure piece by piece over the following months. Personnel, systems, protocols, the 11 physical discrepancies he'd found in the initial audit. He hired Chen formally into the structure. He promoted Dobbins. He brought in 2 people from outside the company whose backgrounds he'd vetted personally, which took longer than anyone on the board wanted, and which he did not accelerate on anyone's timeline but his own. The ArcLight project resumed. Logan didn't involve himself in the technical side. It wasn't his domain, and he had no interest in making it one. But he built the protective infrastructure around it with the full understanding of what it was worth and who would want it. And he designed the security architecture accordingly, layered, redundant, deliberately distributed, with no single point of failure and no single person holding the kind of centralized access that had made Natalie vulnerable in the first place. She reviewed the structure once, in a meeting that was supposed to take an hour and ran to 3 because she had good questions and he had thorough answers. When it was done, she looked at the architecture diagram on the whiteboard he'd used. It was old-fashioned, he knew. Most people use digital displays, but he thought better with a physical marker and a surface he could stand back from. And she said, "This is very good." "Thank you," he said. "I mean it. This is the best security architecture I've seen." "You haven't seen that many security architectures," he said. "I've seen enough," she said. "Don't deflect." He looked at the whiteboard. "It's solid," he said. "It's not perfect. Nothing is." "What's the weakest point?" He pointed to a junction in the middle of the diagram. "This access transfer node. If someone compromised both the biometric and the backup credential system simultaneously, they'd have a window. It's small and it requires resources most parties don't have, but it's there. Can you close it?" "Not without creating a different vulnerability on the other side," he said. "So I monitor it instead. 2 independent systems, neither of which talks to the other, both of which log to a server only I can access." She looked at the diagram for another moment. "You're comfortable with that?" "I'm comfortable with knowing exactly where the weak point is," he said. "That's different from being comfortable with having one." She looked at him. Something in her expression was the same look she'd given him in the parking structure the first night. The one that was assembling a picture of him in real time, adding new information to what was already there. "That's how you live too," she said, "isn't it? You know where the weak points are, and you monitor them instead of trying to eliminate them." He was quiet for a moment. "When did you get a psychology degree?" "I'm observant," she said. "It's basically the same thing." He looked at the diagram. At the junction he'd marked, at the careful layered structure around it, built to be strong enough that the weak point never got tested. "Yeah," he said, "something like that. The thing nobody tells you about the life you build after the life you thought you were going to have. The fallback life, the one constructed from necessity and modified circumstance, is that it doesn't stay a fallback. It becomes the actual one. And then something shifts and expands inside it, and you have to decide whether to let the expansion happen or to hold the walls where they are out of habit and old fear." Logan had held the walls for 8 years. Not because he was a coward. He'd done things that required a specific kind of courage most people never encountered, but because he'd been hurt in ways that went deep enough to rewrite his assumptions about what he was capable of without breaking, and those rewrites take time to correct. What he'd learned, slowly, and with the specific difficulty of things worth learning, was this: the same qualities that made him good at the work that had defined the first half of his adult life. Patience, attention, the ability to hold a great deal of information without distorting it toward the conclusion he preferred, the willingness to stay in an uncomfortable position long enough to understand it fully, were the same qualities that made him capable of the things he'd been most afraid of trusting someone, of being known, of letting Ellie see him as something more complicated than just her father, so that when she was older and understood what complications actually looked like, she'd have a reference point for how a person carried them without being consumed. That wasn't a lesson he'd found in a book or arrived at through a single revelation. It had assembled itself out of 2.5 years of cleaning floors and 4 months of rebuilding a security infrastructure and a Saturday afternoon with a box fan and a 9-year-old's dinner table assessment of a woman who paid attention and a whiteboard diagram with one honest weak point that you monitored because eliminating it entirely would only move the problem somewhere less visible. You didn't fix the weak points by pretending they weren't there. You knew where they were, and you watched them, and you built strong enough around them that they stayed contained. That was as close to wisdom as Logan Mercer had arrived at, and he held it without particular pride, because it had taken him longer than it should have and cost more than it needed to, and the honest thing about hard-won understanding was that it was mostly just catching up to things other people had known for years. In September, Ellie started 4th grade. She had a new teacher she described as fine, but less flexible about minerals. She was working on a new project involving bioluminescence, about which she had questions Logan could not fully answer, which led to 2 library visits and 1 evening with Natalie, who had a biology background from a college she'd attended on a scholarship Logan had learned about months ago and found genuinely impressive, sitting at Logan's kitchen table with Ellie's library books spread between them, explaining the mechanism of light production in deep-sea organisms with the specific animated clarity of a person who found the subject actually interesting. Ellie listened with both elbows on the table and her chin in her hands, the posture she assumed when she was paying maximum attention. Logan sat across from them and drank his coffee and watched them talk. He thought about a parking structure in October, a flickering light, a woman who'd looked at him and asked him to tell her who he was. He thought about the answer he'd given then, which was incomplete, and the answer he'd been assembling since, which was getting closer. He thought about Garfield Street and the new patch of carpet that had almost settled into the old color by now, the seams still faintly visible if you knew where to look, which he always did because he was the one who'd made it. He thought, this is the life. Not the life he'd planned at 22, not the life he'd been building when it fell apart, not the reduced and careful life he'd constructed in the wreckage. This one. The one with the box fan and the bioluminescence project and the woman who remembered things people told her and the 9-year-old who had named a theoretical mineral after herself with complete justification. It was imperfect in more ways than he could count, and it required more honesty than he found comfortable on a daily basis. And there were still mornings when the alarm went off and he lay in the dark for 30 seconds doing the inventory. His nervous system had never fully stopped running and probably never would. But he got up. Every morning, he got up. And the 30 seconds got a little shorter each time, and the rooms around him felt less like places he was visiting and more like his. And outside on Garfield Street, the city did its ordinary morning things, and down the hall, Ellie was waking up and would want her eggs cheesy. And the future was not the thing he'd expected, which meant it was still a future, open and unwritten and not yet lost. The invisible janitor was gone. The soldier had finally found something worth coming home to. And the man who had spent 8 years making himself as small as possible was standing in his own kitchen, in his own life, taking up exactly the amount of space he'd always deserved. No more careful about it than that.